And turning back to 1 Samuel in chapter 18, we return to studying the early life of David as he is brought from the obscurity and peace and quiet, if you like, of the hills of Bethlehem as a young shepherd boy, the youngest of his family, and he is catapulted to the very forefront of the story of Israel. He's anointed, and we've looked at this before, by Samuel back there in the village amongst his brothers. He's told, you're going to be the next king of Israel. And then we fast forward these months and come to chapter 18, and we're coming out now of the valley of Elah, where David has confronted Goliath, where David, in verse 36, said to King Saul, your servant has struck down, verse 36 of chapter 17, your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And we saw that the perspective of faith and the calling on God in dependence was missing from the army of Israel until David arrived in the baggage train that day with supplies from Jesse to hear Goliath's mocking and defying and ridiculing and blaspheming of the God of Israel. And we know that did not end well for Goliath. Chapter 18 then is the aftermath. What happens after David has beheaded Goliath? We know that he cuts his head off with his own sword. The Philistines, they crumble and melt away in terror when they see their champion is dead. This killing machine, who's about 10 foot tall, that no one could possibly stand before, has been taken out with one stone from a wee boy. And they can't recover from this. And the men of Israel rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath, and there was a great slaughter. And there was a real slaughter inflicted upon the Philistines. David takes the head of the giant Goliath, and in so doing we see David as a giant with God. And then we come to chapter 18. And David's fame is about to go into the stratosphere. If before he had been granted celebrity and confidence in the way Samuel had dealt with him and in the way he had been introduced to court life, my goodness, now things are about to move to a whole new level. Saul says at the end of chapter 17, whose son are you, young man? And David answered him, the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. Initially, in the aftermath of the battle in the valley of Elah, the first few verses of chapter 18, we can expect what we read there. It's tremendous, it's heartwarming, it's encouraging, and we see faithfulness and courage and tenacity and this simplicity of David's character, his humility, really standing out and speaking, and he is being rewarded. It seems his faithfulness is going to be rewarded. The Prince of Israel, the Prince of Wales, if you like, Jonathan, the heir to Saul, he recognizes something in David. He gives him, it's very symbolic what Jonathan does here. In the covenant that they entered into in verse 3, Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, his armor and even his sword. And it was as if he knew that before David, he was dressed the wrong way. These were the trappings of royalty that David should be wearing, but not yet. But such was Jonathan's commitment and friendship and love for David that he couldn't bear to stand dressed as the Prince of Israel in his presence, so he gives him these trappings. And it seems really tremendous how this friendship begins immediately following David's standing up and saying, don't be fearful for this uncircumcised Philistine. I will fight him for you. And here David seems to be being rewarded for his faith. But we know, just stepping back from all this, that the Israel that David grew up in was an Israel that was beginning to drift away from God. The culture, the mindset, the attitude at the time had become this insistent demand to Samuel, we want a king. We will have a king. And when Samuel says, this is wrong, you're going down the wrong path, you are doing a disservice to God, you're dishonoring God, they reply, no, we will have a king, because we will have a king to go out and come in from before us to fight our battles. And what was the prevailing sentiment? We want to be like the nations around us. And we saw in this that when Israel looked at the nations around them, they liked what they saw. And that's a real... We just pause as Christians and just take that in and think, here were the people of God looking at godlessness around them, and they liked what they saw. There's a warning there for us. There's a warning there for us that we don't look with longing eyes at culture. That we don't get sucked into a vortex that says, oh, I wish we were like that. Or I wish we were like this. Or I wish I could do what she does. Or I wish I could do the things that he does. Keep our eyes fixed on the Lord. That's what marks David out here. That's what sets him apart and puts him on an entirely different level to everyone around him, the king of Israel included. But the king of Israel is becoming symptomatic of the country of Israel and the people who insisted on his appointment and on his being anointed king before them. He too is not looking to the Lord. And we're going to see a lot more of that here in this chapter, because that's perhaps the first heading to just take note of this evening. In chapter 18, we find selfish ambition. Selfish ambition. After a nice start, everything goes downhill in this chapter very, very quickly. Jonathan very symbolically gives David the trappings of royalty. Verse 5, David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war, which perhaps is a reference to the royal guard or the bodyguard of the king. So he had immediate control over the military men, the troops around the king. That's prominence. Nobody knew David. Nobody knew him, apart from his own family, just a day before. But such is the significance of his actions in taking on Goliath and defeating him and delivering the army of the Philistines into the hand of Israel. He's in superstardom now. He is launched into the stratosphere of fame, popularity, and celebrity. And we'll think about that as we go through, because if anything today, that could very well tip anyone over the edge. Fame, fortune, celebrity, instant stardom, financial worries over in a heartbeat, your family forever exempt from being taxed. You've been brought into the royal court, it would seem, being offered the hand of the princess. You're going to be the son-in-law of the king. You're the commander of the royal bodyguard. In a heartbeat, you've taken out the Philistine champion. How easy would it have been for David to be blown off course here? Because, as we know, the best of men are men at best. And that's why it's so good to read through this chapter, and we see that does not present itself in David. His character speaks volumes, and it speaks of humility and faithfulness. He's not blown off course. He deals with this as it comes his way. But someone is blown off course. And that someone, of course, is the king. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, we see bands of women in the Israelite communities, in the cities, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines and songs, and they have reason to rejoice because their men are coming home. They've had a great victory. So the worry and anxiety of the battle going on, that's past. The men of Israel are coming home, and they've had victory, and so the women sing, and they give thanks, and they sang to one another and celebrated. Saul has struck his thousands, and David his 10,000, and Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. And now things begin to go downhill rapidly. Selfish, then, ambition. The effect of David's victory over Goliath was far-reaching indeed. This battle is followed by a confirmation in Jonathan's actions of an acknowledgement that David is the one. Not himself, but David will continue the rule over Israel. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. But his father is a different beast altogether. Well, all this bodes well until this point, that rather than rejoicing, even enjoying or soaking in a sense of relief at the deliverance that had been brought through David, Saul only sees a threat. He was angry. They have ascribed to David 10,000s. To me, they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. Selfish ambition. Why would the king of Israel see a threat from within Israel when they're in a permanent state of war with the Philistines? The answer lies in the heart of the king. He saw a threat because he's full of selfish ambition, a condition that is always fueled by pride. And pride brings out this jealousy in the king. Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, verse 10 tells us, Saul has opened himself up to jealousy, fueling his pride because he's full of himself. Selfish ambition is his dominant thought. Saul eyed David like, he wants my kingdom. Wait a minute, Saul. Just the day before in the valley of Elah, Israel was paralyzed. 6 weeks, this Goliath had come out in the morning and in the evening. He had defied and desecrated and humiliated Israel. And he had defied the armies of the living God. And nobody was doing anything. You were in your tent. No one saw you. There was no leadership. Samuel was not there. There was no dependence on the Lord. And then David comes in and through him. And how does Saul react? Jealous. He saw a threat. And the pattern of Saul's reign seems to follow this downward spiral. And it's a spiral that seems to just revolve around his own pride. Look how he reacts. He was very angry. The people, the women, the celebration, the adulation, the celebrity, it wasn't going to him. It was going to the one who had earned it. And the king didn't like that. He didn't want that. He wanted to put himself in front of David and say, praise me, honor me, give me all the glory, give me all your adulation, give me the celebrity. So David from that one immediately turns in his heart to say, what more can he have but the kingdom? And his reign begins to just unravel and spiral out of all control. And we can very quickly say this. There is no room for God if you are full of yourself. That's quite clear. There is no room for God if you are full of yourself. And pride, as a number one emphasis and focus, is always self. Self. Nothing matters more to pride than self. Because pride, you see, it's a dispelling force. It's an expulsive force. And it chokes all thoughts of good or worth in others. And that's the fault with Saul. He was very angry. There's no sense of gratitude. There's no words of warmth or welcome or thanksgiving to the crowds who have come out to meet them, having received this great victory. It's not enough that he's the king. It's not enough that he's got the crown. He wants it all. He wants the attention, the adulation. He wants everything. That's what pride does. Pride is insatiable and demands and insists always that it's all about self, not others. Pride, you see, demands center stage, longs to be praised, exalts itself. What do we say of pride in the Bible? Tonight we've sung from Psalm 138, although the Lord God dwells on high, the lowly person he protects, whereas the proud and haughty ones he knows afar off and rejects. So also in David, something that he himself did not have, and we'll see this toward the end of this section here. Saul saw that he had great success, and he stood in fearful awe of him. Why? Because in verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. And there's the heart of it. In many ways, you could draw a line to the conflict that had taken place in the Valley of Elah, where Goliath had presented himself as the ultimate man, the great champion, the warrior that could never be defeated. And he defied the armies of Israel. Having been defeated and removed from the face of the earth by the young shepherd boy with one stone. He took 5, but he only needed 1. The quiet years of his training in the fields of Bethlehem had not been put to waste. And David shows the skill and just how lethal he was with that piece of equipment. He had turned the sling into a weapon, a deadly weapon. 1 stone, Goliath, it's all over. No contest. A giant with men is utterly defeated by the giant with God. And that is what we must see in Saul's response and conduct and bearing here. The selfish ambition. In Saul, there's an increasing awareness of man. Look what he says here. They have ascribed to David 10,000s. To me, they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have? See what his focus is? They. He's more consumed and aware of the people around him than the living God. And what put him in this position in the first place? Israel's obsession with the nations around them. We can draw another line, and we see taking their eye off the Lord and wanting to be like the nations. Well, now they are like the nations, and they've got a king who, just like the nations, is not interested with God, but obsessed himself, and he's about to launch the country into years of conflict and war and suffering, and it's all revolving around his pride and his hatred for David, the Lord's anointed. Now, I made a mess of taking down this quote, but let me share it with you. I think it was Spurgeon who said this. Pride is the oldest sin in the universe and shows no sign of growing weaker with age. It is the greatest hindrance to revival amongst the Lord's people. Why? It is the devil's masterpiece to make us think well of ourselves. My goodness, that's quite searching. It is the devil's masterpiece to make us think well of ourselves. It's a trap. It's a trap. If he can massage the ego, fan the flames of pride and self-sufficiency, make us think about we're all it, make us think by looking in the mirror we see the answer to all the issues and problems, then we're going to do it all, aren't we? But that's the devil's answer. That's what the devil wants the Christian church looking in Edinburgh tonight. Look in the mirror. You'll sort this all out for yourself. Never mind that book. Don't talk about prayer, grace, faith and salvation. And don't even mention hell and judgment. Don't go there. Just talk about Jesus if you have to because it's Christmas. But that's it. That's the kind of place he wants us. And then we begin to thinking we're it and we're all it, taking in his, falling for his lie, this greatest hindrance to revival amongst the Lord's people is the devil's masterpiece to make us think well of ourselves. King Saul, what do we say about him? Jealousy, envy, deceit. He was a user. To the extent he was a failure as a king and as a leader. That's quite clear. An increasing obsession with men and a decreasing awareness of God. Selfish ambition. Something else in this section, and that is, and we've just read this first part of chapter 18 this evening, and we see while the chapter goes off to a great start, then begins to spiral downhill, we can almost feel concern for how's David going to emerge from this. Well, he's the shining light in this chapter. Saul was angry. He was consumed with himself. The root of bitterness had taken hold. And then we see that this root of bitterness and jealousy and envy, verse 10, he tries to kill David for the first time. David was playing the lyre as the harmful spirit has been permitted by the Lord to rush upon Saul. That can be literally translated that Saul was in prophecy. He was prophesying. That's what the language, when he raged within his house, that's what the language is telling us here. But he's doing so with his spear in his hand. It is a very negative, oppressive, heavy, dangerous scene that's being presented. And what does Saul do? He hurls his spear, thinking, consumed with himself, I will pin David to the wall. He wants to run him through. He wants to spear him to death. But David twice evades him. And then Saul's fear begins to really take hold. And so what does he do? This verse 13, I believe, we should look on this as a demotion. That's the first thing he does. Failing to kill him twice, he then demotes him. He removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. He took him away from the royal guard. He gave him a battalion and he sent him out on operational duty. Why? And as we read on, we know he was hoping that the Philistines would do the job for him and kill him on the battlefield. He removed him. He gave him a battalion and he went out and came in before the people. And then what happened? David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. Selfish ambition is followed here in this passage by, secondly, selfless service. Selfless service. Now, when we turn to David, you'd think, well, between them, here's someone who had reason to be proud. Here's someone who could puff out his chest and say, look at me, here's the head of Goliath. Do you want me to tell you about how I did it? But of course we don't read that. We don't see that here. I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. That's how David refers to himself before Saul, having given Israel this incredible victory. Having taken out the giant with one stone, I am the son of your servant. That's all I am. We see such humility here. Selflessness. It's the opposite of Saul in every way. Although the Lord God dwells on high, the lowly person he protects. Whereas the proud and haughty one, he knows afar off and rejects. Just quickly notice this here in this chapter. The overnight celebrity status that David has to deal with, that it lands on him, it does not knock him sideways. It doesn't set him off on chasing a celebrity. He doesn't put himself up there and say, let me tell you more about myself. I'm talking about myself all day. That's not David. It doesn't happen. He doesn't allow pride to get a foothold. Chapter 17 is a great reminder for us how this worked out. Just to look at one verse, it's verse 47. All this assembly may know, said David to the Philistine, that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. David wasn't there to talk about himself and to say, I'm here to sort you out. And throughout chapter 18, you'll notice that we don't hear David speak. What speaks for him is his character. David, in verse 14, had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. And we shouldn't notice the word there in what happened when David dealt with his demotion. David had success in all his undertakings. Undertakings. He was told, put your armour on, take your weapons, go and lead the soldiers, protect the barriers, protect the frontiers, get onto the battlefield. Put himself in harm's way. He wasn't just a worshipper, David was a warrior. Here we see him beginning to develop his soldiery, his mastery of his profession of arms on the battlefield, and a born leader of men. That's what we have here. a born leader of men. All Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. There was something in his character, in his integrity, in his humility, in his devotion, in his faithfulness that shone and spoke. And the people, the men, the soldiers, followed him. Followed him. I can think of one or two characters in my own time in the forces who really stood out as born natural soldiers and leaders of men. One or two I can think of in particular. And it was their conduct, their bearing, their ability that made the soldiers follow their officers on deployment, on operational commitments. They followed them. They listened to them. They hung on every word. I saw it. And I knew it was because of their ability. And I saw one officer he took a group of young soldiers around him, and they were on operations in Afghanistan. And you're thinking, here's the big lesson of life coming in. And it was simple and it's straightforward. And he said, men, he said, never forget, sleep is a weapon. It's not the last. We just didn't expect to hear that. Sleep is a weapon. Look after yourselves. And that was just this natural leadership, this man as a soldier looking after his men. And I think we have that here in David. He had success in his undertakings. This didn't just happen by itself. The victories didn't just roll off a conveyor belt. David had to go out and fight and win these victories. And he led his soldiers and do so as a youngster. And they loved him. And they followed him. And for he went out and came in before them. David never hid. He never hid. And his character here speaks. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. Verse 5. Then again in verse 14. David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. Saul saw that he had great success. He stood in fearful awe of him. And then at the end of the chapter in verse 30, the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle. And as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. Selfless service. Lessons for living. What made David better than Saul? Was it just the oil that Samuel poured in his head? No. It was the faith in his heart. It was his love for the Lord. He was better than Saul because his heart was not ruled by selfish ambition. David was not full of himself, as Saul was. David was not fueled by pride. He was a better man than Saul because he was a man after God's own heart. And in his selfless service, he was given over to following God. And his lifestyle and conduct and character and bearing, it's here in the chapter. And it's wonderful because it speaks for him. And we see this in other characters in the Bible. We noticed this in Joseph when we looked at his life at the start of the year, where there are great swathes of time pass in Genesis record of the life of Joseph, where there is no dialogue, where Joseph doesn't speak, but his character does. His faithfulness shines through. His dependence on God is evident and obvious. And what we can see then of David in chapter 18 is in dealing with this fame and power and authority. And you know, it's been well said, I think it was Winston Churchill, if you want to test a man, don't give him wealth, give him power. And that's what David was given here. Military command, status, adulation, celebrity. He had it all. And it does not affect him one bit. That tells us that in David there was a great consistency. A great consistency. And so we see in chapter 18 that we can be great witnesses to the Lord without speaking. I think that's one level of application we can take from the chapter without pushing it too much. There's no dialogue, there's no conversation, there's conduct, there's character. There's consistency in David's selfless service. Lessons for living, and that also leads us on to lessons for leading. We can't underestimate David's role at this time in this place. Even when he's demoted from the royal guard and given a battalion and sent out from the presidency, he was removed. Saul removed him from his presence. It got to the stage already and very rapidly that he couldn't bear to look on him. He couldn't bear to look on him. And that's underlined in verse 15. He stood in fearful awe of him. The light's on. It seems that the truth of the situation is dawning on Saul. The Lord is with David. This must be his successor, the one who is better than he is. And he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David. And that's another theme in this chapter, this theme of love. The love that Jonathan displays to David, the love that the people display for David, the love that the soldiers display for David, the love that Michal, Saul's daughter, displays in this chapter for David. All these things that could so have blown him off course, but it doesn't happen. Lessons then for leading. David here in this chapter is a great example. An example that we can follow, because he doesn't just he knew the way to love and please God. And that's how he lived. And because that's the way he lived, he provides an example to everyone. Faithfulness before the Lord. He served God, not by following his own path. He didn't stomp up to the royal court. He didn't go looking for Samuel and say, "Where's my crown? When do I get this throne?" And another thing that's very apparent in this chapter is David's patience and willingness to wait. He's been anointed and told in Bethlehem, "You will be the Lord's anointed." And then we read, chapter 18, verse 11, Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David evaded him twice. So when we don't hear David speak, it's very obvious, or I think natural, to think, my goodness, he wouldn't have expected this. Having been anointed by Samuel and told he would reign, he's now having to dive for cover from Saul's spear twice. He's on the run, but he's been told he's going to be the king. How come a spear has just missed his head? And so David could again have taken the wrong path and shown an impatience, an unbelief, a weakness. We don't read of it anywhere. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. And so David lived for the Lord. He put God first and foremost in his decisions, and the challenges, and how unsettling that must have been for him. He's been taken from his home, and Jesse, his father, and all his brothers. He's no longer looking after sheep. He's leading men in combat. And he's had the king now try to kill him twice. He's had the king's son acknowledge he will be the next king. And he's had all this going on in his young days. And his faithfulness shines through. God prospered him. All Israel and Judah loved him. David had success because the Lord was with him, because David was patient, because David was not impatient and demanding and selfish, but faithful and humble and committed to follow the Lord's path. David got on with the business, what he'd been told to do, lead the men of Israel into battle, these undertakings that began to develop his craft and leadership and generalship. And the Lord was with him. God prospered him. This just tells us this finally. We have to be right with God in order to be of use to God. And as we are of use to God, by being led by God, we all become leaders for God. Leaders of who? Leaders of those around us who do not know him. And that's our task. That's our undertakings. Thankfully, we're not being sent into combat. We're not being told to go and find the Philistine hordes. What we are being told is to make disciples of all nations. And we take the Great Commission to heart, and we seek to be faithful and loving and patient, and seek the Lord's guidance, and seek to be faithful witnesses, leaders, and examples and signposts, so that people around us will see something of the faith in Christ that we profess, and above all, the Christ we know and love. And that's what will make the difference in Edinburgh tonight, in the workplace tomorrow, in the community, in the shops and in the neighbourhoods. Christians being consistent, faithful, truthful, compassionate, patient witnesses to the Lord. maybe we'll know success. Wouldn't that be wonderful? David certainly had success in all his undertakings. Not many will have that said of them. But here at this point in his life, that's exactly what David knew. Wonderful. Not many of us can relate to that. But what is our calling? To have success or to be faithful? To follow the Lord, to seek him, the lowly person he protects, whereas the proud and haughty one he knows afar off and rejects. In the next verse, although I walk a troubled path, your tender care preserves my life. You raise your hand against my foes. Your right hand saves me from their strife. May God bless us as we take him at his word and live for him, as David did, faithfully. We'll pray together. Lord our God, we pray your blessing upon us tonight, that you would help us to learn anew how to live for you. Bless, Lord, your word to our hearts. And may we take to heart the example of David in his selfless service. And grant, Lord, we would avoid that ancient lie of the devil, who would fan into flame our ego and pride in a moment. Lord, we would resist him. We would resist him in his lies and his deceit and his temptations, that we might live for you and do so faithfully. Hear as we pray for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, we'll close our service. We'll turn to sing Psalms and sing from Psalm 25 and verse 8. Psalm 25, and we'll sing from verse 8 in this psalm. We'll sing to verse 15. Because the Lord is just and good, he shows his path to all who stray. He guides the meek in what is right and teaches them his holy way. We'll sing to verse 15 to God's praise.